I love finding local bars with an interesting selection of whiskey. So today I'm at Rack City Pool Hall and Bar. It's a Japanese themed venue with a great whiskey selection. Hey guys, I'm Nath Martyn, the Whisky Scribe. I'm a whiskey enthusiast and I love all things whiskey. But taste is subjective and there's a lot of different whiskies out there. So whether you consider yourself a connoisseur or you're just looking to understand more about whiskey, let's explore it all together. If you haven't already subscribed, hit that button now. I put up new videos every week. You can also follow me over on Instagram. Every city has at least a few pool halls where you can go and play a game without having to fight for the table like you would in a normal pub scenario. But the owners of Rack City wanted to create something a little bit different. And they were in Japan and really enjoyed the atmosphere and the high-end quality of the bar scene over there. And that's why Rack City on Brisbane's south side has this great atmosphere of Japanese artwork, this really cool vibe, and a fantastic selection of Japanese whiskey. But today I'm going to be looking at four in particular. We've got the Suntory Toki, the Yamzaki 12-year single malt, the Chita single grain whiskey, and Hibiki Blender's Choice. While they all have different names, they all come from the Suntory whiskey family. Now, Suntory was the first malt whiskey distillery started in Japan in 1923. These are all respectable whiskies. In fact, the Toki recently featured in my 5 Affordable Whiskies video. I'm going to leave this one to the end to come back to because there's a really interesting reason as to why this one fits in so nicely with this selection. But let's get into tasting them. Now, the first distillery built by Suntory was in the Vale of Yamzaki for its pure water, diverse climate and high humidity, all of which are fantastic for making whiskey. And that's where the Yamzaki 12-year-old is made. So this is a 12-year-old single malt whiskey that has spent time in American, Spanish and Japanese oak, bottled at 43%. So straight away when you look at that, there's some gold color there. So there's some nice gold color in there. And on the nose, you're getting quite a bit of grain. It seems like a little bit of a default to say that a single malt whiskey has notes of malted barley, but you don't always pick that up. But in this case, you definitely do. That's right at the forefront. And then in the background, you've got sort of a little bit of this sweet, it's almost honey, but it's a little bit different. Kind of almost minty. That's really lovely. Before I say anything about the taste, after pouring it back down, after taking a sip, you can really see the thick legs in here. So this is a nice oily whiskey, which carries a lot of that flavor across. And straight away, the first thing I got was sort of shortbread. This buttery shortbread flavor that was really, really nice. And there's some interesting background sort of fruit flavors that you got in there. I'd probably call it more stone fruit. but there's a nice balance between the sweetness and the oak. They marry across quite well. It's unmistakably a single malt whiskey, but there's a slightly different element to the sweetness in there. And the finish carries across quite nicely, and that sweetness lasts on the palate for a long time. Probably what I would say about the barrel aging of this, I said that it's Spanish, American, and Japanese oak. The Spanish oak is ex-sherry cask, and that's where a lot of that, you do have a bit of berry sweetness coming across in there, which comes from that sherry. The American oak is ex-bourbon cask, which is almost default. It's almost hard to find a whiskey that hasn't spent at least some time in an ex-bourbon cask. But the Japanese oak is what's really interesting. So that's a form of oak called Mezzanera cask. Mezzanera is a Japanese oak that it actually grows quite knotty. So you wouldn't want to, it'd be quite difficult to turn it into staves to make a barrel. So the Japanese never really bothered with it. But in World War II, when the Americans weren't selling ex-bourbon casks to the Japanese, they still needed to be able to put their whiskey in something. And that's when they started looking around, trying to find something else they could use. And they figured, well, we've got Mezzanera oak, we'll give it a try. And while it took a lot of work to make a cask out of Mezzanera oak, it imparted this really unique sweetness that you don't get from any other barrel aging. And it's in the background in here. It is this almost melony sweetness, kind of borders on almost like a Madeira cake. It's really unique, and that's why I love that this is part of their Japanese whiskey lineup, because Japanese whiskey is strongly Scottish influenced, and any flavour that you get from a Japanese whiskey, while they make really good whiskey, it could be also found in a Scottish whiskey. The only thing that is definitively Japanese when it comes to whiskey is that Mezzanera cask. And the Yamzaki 12-year-old has just enough of that to make this a proper Japanese whiskey that is beyond comparison to any Scottish single malt. Next, we have the Chita, which was Suntory's first single grain whiskey. The Chita distillery has been making grain whiskey for Suntory's blends since the 1970s, but in 2015, they finally released the Chita as its own single grain whiskey. Interestingly, the single grain made at the Chita distillery is actually corn, but it doesn't come across like a corn whiskey or a bourbon. And that's because it's distilled through multiple columns to produce a really clean spirit, which for this was then aged in ex-red wine Spanish oak casks and some ex-bourbon casks, because that's just unavoidable. So it's a non-age statement, and it's bottled at 43%. So being a single grain whiskey, I'm trying to find the right light to actually be able to look at this, but being a single grain whiskey, it does have a much lighter colour. It hasn't spent anywhere near as much time in the casks as the Yamzaki, but that's not always a problem. So it's a very light, I would call it more like a straw sort of colour. On the nose though, okay, so I still maintain that this doesn't come across like a bourbon, but there is a little bit of a caramelised sort of sweetness coming across here. And not the intense caramel that you sort of tends to get from a bourbon cask, but it's sort of more like a creme brulee almost. Yeah, it's different to bourbon, but it's still different to a single malt whiskey. So first off, I would say, even though this is a non-age statement, it's quite smooth. I'm not getting anything in here that would imply that it's a very young whiskey. And it's got a wonderfully buttery texture, and it's this sort of like a deep wooded honey flavour in there. There's a little bit of that creme brulee sort of sweetness that I had on the nose that's carried through. There's next to no vanilla, and vanilla is something that you often get from an ex-bourbon cask, which tells me that even though it's quite light in colour, I would say that they've probably lent a lot more into the red wine cask on this, and the ex-bourbon cask would probably be kind of supportive. Because it's such a smooth whiskey, the finish is a little bit shorter than the Yamzaki, but it's not disappointing by any means. In fact, I would probably call this more of a session whiskey in that it's not so confronting on the palate that you could very easily keep sipping on this one all night long. I could keep sipping on this one all night long. Now, while single grain whiskies aren't typically the norm, especially if you're a Scotch drinker, they can still be really, really interesting, as is the case here. I would probably recommend this for somebody who does want to try whiskey, but they don't really enjoy those stronger, bolder flavors that you tend to get from something like a single malt or something that's peated. It's a very nice, soft introduction to whiskey that I don't think any whiskey drinker would necessarily be disappointed with, because there's still plenty of flavor there. There's just nothing that's too over the top. It would also go really, really nicely in a Japanese highball, which is just a standard built cocktail. It's a shot of Japanese whiskey topped up with soda water. It's one of the few ways I think where you can mix a whiskey in with a cocktail and you still really get to appreciate the whiskey, because it opens up some of the softer notes that you may not be getting initially on the palate. Adding the soda water just lets it air a little bit more, and it's a little bit more refreshing than drinking a room temperature spirit neat. The Hibiki line of whiskey was launched in 1989 by Suntory to commemorate their ethos of living in harmony with people and nature. So the name Hibiki in Japanese means resonance, and this whiskey is very much synonymous with the idea of luxury in Japan. And one of the really cool features about this bottle too is you notice that it's got all these angled sides on it. There's 24 sides in total, and it's meant to reflect the 24 seasons of the traditional Japanese calendar. Now, the Hibiki is a blended whiskey, so that means it's a combination of malted whiskey and single grain whiskey. Now, a lot of whiskey drinkers tend to fall in either side of the camp. They're either a blended whiskey fan or they're a single malt fan. Personally, I think there's good and bad whiskies in both categories, so I try not to be too judgmental of one or the other. But the Hibiki, as far as a blended whiskey goes, this is definitely on the higher end of things. This is a premium blended whiskey. So they've only used the best whiskey from ex-wine casks to give this a sweet yet deep profile. It's a non-age statement and it's bottled at 43%. So I've spoken about how much I like the 24 sides in this bottle, but it's also got a glass stopper. And check this out. It has a cork. If you're drinking Scottish whiskey, quite often, whether or not they've got a cork can be a little bit of a measure of the quality. It doesn't affect the whiskey so much, but if it's a screw top Scottish whiskey, it's usually a cheaper whiskey. If it's got a cork, it's probably a single malt or a little bit more high end. Japanese whiskey, that's not a good unit of measure. Most Japanese whiskey does come with screw tops. The Yamzaki, for instance, this is a high end whiskey, but it's got a screw top. But for the Hibiki, Blender's choice, they've gone with a cork, which shouldn't matter to me, but I just love it. I have respect for that. So this has got a golden color. It has been aged in ex-red wine casks, but I would say based on this color, those barrels were probably scraped and recharred to make sure that you weren't getting a lot of the red wine in there. You were getting more of the wood that had been influenced by the red wine cask. I was trying to find the legs, and at first I thought this had next to no legs, but it turns out they are so thick and so slow running that it just took a minute of looking at the glass before they even started to form. So straight off the cuff, that tells me that this is a really oily whiskey that is probably going to carry quite a bit of flavor. And there's some really interesting scents on the nose here. So I'm getting bits of, like I would call it toasted nuts. There's a little bit of toffee in here. There's even a little bit of zest that you might call citrus. And there's some fruity notes in here too. Like I would call it almost like black currants, which is a wonderful fruity note to get off a whiskey and must come from the red wine casks. I can wait no longer. I don't like to pick favorites, but I would say that this is probably my favorite of this lineup. What was black currant on the nose has come across almost a little bit like a dark cherry on the palate. It's very buttery, which from those thick legs, you would expect it to be that buttery. You can pick up elements of the wood in here as well, and there's a very faint element that you might call smoke, but I think it's more like char. So that does back up my initial impression that while this is predominantly aged in red wine casks, I would say they haven't put it into wet red wine casks. They would probably have scraped and charred them, because I'm getting that little bit of smoke that comes from that re-toasting of the wood. But that buttery note on the palate, it carries it across. So all of those flavors that you're tasting on the palate, they linger for such a long time. They're there in the mouth well after you finish drinking it. And that's beautiful. I love that because it's such like a long expression. You've got the beautiful nose that you can sniff for a long time. And then the body of the whiskey, that like actually drinking it is really enjoyable. But then that finish, it still just carries that along so that it's a full experience. As far as blended whiskeys go, I would probably say this is probably one of the best blended whiskeys I've had. Yeah. I would say this is one of the best blended whiskeys I've ever had. Just that texture on the mouth, it just carries so much flavor across. And if you told me this was a single malt, I'd probably believe you, because I feel like sometimes a blended whiskey can have a little bit of an element of lightness. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but you can just tell that difference between a single malt and a blend. In this case, I am not getting that at all. This is full-bodied, full-flavored. That is a fantastic blend, and rightfully categorized as a premium whiskey. Now, as I said, this is a blend, and the other whiskey that we were talking about today was the Toki. Now, what's really interesting is, so a blended whiskey is a combination of single malt whiskey and grain whiskey, and that's what Toki is too, but both of these whiskeys are a combination of Yamzaki, Chita, and Hibiki. That's the three whiskeys that go into making both of these blends. Now, the whiskey that they've selected for here, they've chosen the best barrels out of those, but effectively the base spirit comes from the same location for both of these. So it gives you this really cool opportunity to do a little bit of almost like a taste test. You could get a glass of the Toki and a glass of the Hibiki and compare the two as effectively the same raw spirit, but just aged differently and in different barrels. And if you really wanted to have some fun, I would say bring your whiskey snobbiest friend to the bar and buy them a glass of each neat and see if they can work out which one is technically the premium whiskey, because they're both good. This is definitely my favorite. But if you're not a big fan of some of those sweeter wine elements that come across in a whiskey, they might actually lean more towards this one. And it'd be really fun to catch a whiskey snob out and get them to say that the budget, affordable whiskey is the better one. The games we play. So that's the whiskey selection at Rack City. And it really does give you a good range of options. So you've got your Toki, which is an affordable entry-level whiskey that's good for whiskey cocktails. You've got, again, a nice, affordable single grain whiskey that's great for sipping. Yamzaki for those who want a single malt that's got a little bit of a Japanese influence on it. And then the beautiful Hibiki for that high-end blended whiskey. So if you're in Brisbane and you're into whiskey and/or pool, come on by and check them out. Rack City is open until late every night. They've got a great selection of food, tap beers and cocktails, as well as wonderful whiskey. But until next time, enjoy what's in your glass and come by.